Rhetorical constraints. Be sure to pause and rewind the video at any time to take notes and reflect. Another gift Lloyd Bitzer gave to the modern study of rhetoric is our idea of rhetorical constraints. Rhetorical constraints are the various expectations, obstacles, and advantages that dictate how an author ought to persuade. It's basically all of the outside information that shapes what an author does when they try to persuade in a text. And these elements are formed from the rhetorical situation. Remember, rhetoric is situational. An idea that might be persuasive in one situation may not be persuasive in another. To illustrate this, let's look at a couple of hypothetical rhetorical situations. In the first, we have a child who drew on the wall and a parent scolding them. In the second, we have a labor union protesting long hours and the company addressing that. In our first situation, the speaker would be a parent. The subject would be the damage done to the wall. The audience would be the child that did the damage. The setting would be a home, any time period. It really doesn't matter. The exigence of this situation would be that the child drew on the wall, and the purpose would be to prevent the child from ever trying to draw on the wall again. In our second situation, the speaker would be the CEO of the company. The subject would be employment conditions, working conditions. The audience would be the workers who are on strike. The setting would be outside the factory, sometime post-industrial revolution. The exigence would be that the workers are striking for shorter working hours. And the CEO's purpose would be to convince them to end the strike and come back to work. So, if our purpose is to dissuade the child from drawing on the wall in the future, one effective persuasive technique might be to appeal to their sense of shame. If we shame the child by telling them they are too old to do something like this, or explain to them how much time, energy, and money the speaker must now spend to fix the wall, then the speaker could effectively get through to that child and provoke an emotional response of shame. And this might be an effective form of persuasion for a couple of different reasons. One, the speaker is in a position of power over the audience, in this case, the parent of a child. And the audience, the child, is one that looks up to the speaker and respects them. So they would certainly feel much more strongly if they were to be shamed by that person. And also, the audience is clearly in the wrong here. There's no gray shades to look at. The audience has done something wrong, and pointing that out and making them feel guilty for it could be an effective means of persuasion. Now, in our second scenario, if we tried to use the exact same technique, evoking shame, it wouldn't go so well. If our speaker were to stand up and shame these workers by telling them about workers overseas who work much longer hours yet don't complain about it, or telling them that they ought to be happy to even have a job when so many are unemployed, this could backfire in quite a big way. This would not be an effective form of persuasion because there's completely different dynamics between the speaker and the audience. While the speaker does have some power and authority over the audience does not inherently respect the speaker. They work for the speaker, but that does not mean the speaker is deserving of their respect. Also, the audience has not done anything wrong. They're simply using their power as a labor force to collectively negotiate. And in this situation, the speaker may be in fact wrong. And so using shame to try to convince them to stop their strike would probably not just not work, but probably make the situation worse. So it's clear from our examples that rhetorical constraints come from the relationships between the elements of the rhetorical situation. So when you're trying to figure out what sort of rhetorical constraints a speaker faces, think about these sorts of things. What key factors exist between the speaker and the subject matter, which is what the speaker's talking about? How much of an authority is the speaker on the subject matter? How involved in or personally affected by the subject matter is the speaker? You should also look at what key factors exist between the speaker and between the audience and the subject matter, what the speaker is saying. How familiar is the topic to the audience? How accepting or opposed to the topic would the audience naturally be? How comfortable or uncomfortable is this subject matter? How involved in or affected by the subject matter is the audience? We also need to examine the key factors that exist between the speaker and the audience. What similarities or differences are there in their ideologies, religious beliefs, ethnicity, gender, and so on? What about in socioeconomic class or social status? Is one in a position of power or authority over the other? All of these things will help influence the way the audience takes in the speaker's message. Lastly, we can't forget setting. Remember, setting is the circle that hits all 3 points on the rhetorical triangle. We need to ask ourselves how setting affects these relationships, because the time period and the place will create different rhetorical constraints. For example, think back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. He delivered that speech in 1963 in Washington, D.C. Now, think about it again if he had been somehow transported back in time. Let's say he tried delivering that same speech in 1920s Louisiana. While not totally hospitable, 1963 was far more progressive as a time period in the United States than 1920. Also, the Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, was much safer for a black man to deliver a message like this than Louisiana had been back in the 1920s, with the very quick rise of the Ku Klux Klan and all the lynchings that they had going on. When we look for rhetorical constraints within a rhetorical situation, they often manifest themselves in 3 different ways. We have obstacles, which are the elements of the situation that the speaker must overcome in order to achieve their purpose. We have advantages, which are those elements of the situation that are actively helping the speaker achieve their purpose. And then we have expectations, the elements of the situation that sort of dictate what would be considered ordinary and normal within this particular rhetorical situation. Think back once more to Fred Rogers' testimony. Some of the obstacles he faced within the rhetorical situation would be things like this. He's a little-known TV show host speaking to some of the most powerful people in the country. He's also asking for his budget to remain intact, even though the Senate needs to cut federal spending. Also, his audience, the senators in this hearing, do not directly benefit from his show, since they are not the target viewers, his target viewers being children. These are all things that are in Fred Rogers' way, these things that present themselves as obstacles that he has to overcome in order to achieve his purpose. There are some advantages in his situation, however. He is advocating for something that helps children, and everyone wants to help children. That's just a natural instinct that we have. Fred Rogers is also an expert in child development and psychology, and by being an expert, he kind of is naturally trustworthy on this particular topic. So while there are obstacles in his way, there are certain things that he can use to his advantage. And again, all of these are considered constraints because they shape what he ends up doing with his persuasion. As a rule of thumb, when you're examining a rhetorical situation, you're going to find more obstacles than advantages. And this really makes sense because any situation that requires persuasion means that there are certain things getting in the speaker's way. If the speaker somehow had more advantages than obstacles, then there really wouldn't be a need for persuasion. The speaker would need only state what they want, and the advantages would be enough to convince the audience. So when we're studying a piece of persuasion and we're looking at that rhetorical situation, it's natural for there to be more obstacles within the rhetorical constraints than advantages. Continuing our look at Fred Rogers' testimony, let's look at the last kind of rhetorical constraint, expectations. These are the sort of things that are considered what a speaker would normally do in a given situation that kind of guide how he conducts himself and the type of persuasion that he uses. So one of the expectations we have here is that Fred Rogers is in the chambers of the United States Senate, and therefore he's expected to conduct himself with respect. Also, he's giving legal testimony, which means he must answer questions directly and truthfully. Finally, he's delivering a speech through his testimony, not writing a text. So he must use syntax that is simple and easy to follow, because there's no way for the audience to go back and reread something for better comprehension. So all of these sorts of things influence what it is that Fred Rogers ends up doing to be successful. And lastly, looking at expectations, as a known minister, his audience would expect his speech to be delivered something like a sermon. And if we listen to the whole speech, we hear that it does sound a whole lot like a Sunday sermon. So he's kind of meeting those expectations for the situation. Also, as a Baptist minister, he's expected to take a polite tone, even as he condemns something as heinous as bigotry and racial prejudice. Being able to identify rhetorical constraints is vital to our study of rhetoric. Because in order to understand why an author says what they say, we need to first understand the various obstacles, advantages, and expectations that they were dealing with. That's all for this video on rhetorical constraints. Now move on to complete the corresponding assignment.